Mm. So I'm here today with Hannah Drake from Enerlytic. Hannah and I met recently and had a really interesting conversation about the work that's doing and Enerlytic are doing for schools to help with their school energy efficiency as the topic of today's conversation. So without any further ado, I'll pass over to Hannah to tell us a little bit more about her journey in Enerlytic and ask you some questions at the end if you're happy with that, Hannah.
Fantastic. Yeah, no problem at all. So just by way of introduction, Hannah Drake, founder and CEO of Enerlytic. My background is in the energy space and worked with organisations on their energy strategies. And it was very apparent, years ago, even that there's an issue with accessing, but most importantly, understanding energy data. And I think there's no more relevant time than now with the recent energy crisis, and with the pressure on any organisation, but specifically in this case schools, to look at how they can save on energy costs, and a key part of that is looking at what they can do with consumption. So I have got a presentation that I can share, and just a couple of tips and things that we can start looking at now, some low-hanging fruit I would call it, to see where you can start your journey in terms of the cost saving aspect of energy costs.
That's great. Thanks, Hannah. I think it'll certainly be of interest. So over to you with the presentation.
Yeah, no problem. Can you see this okay?
I can, yeah.
Fantastic. So at the moment in the UK, businesses waste around £60 million worth of energy every year. And I think the old phrase that everyone uses now is you can't reduce what you can't measure. So Enerlytic was really set up to provide users with a better understanding of how they are consuming energy, where they're consuming, and what makes up that consumption. So we really provide key insights into energy data, and focus really on three areas: energy consumption, cost, and carbon emissions. But as a starting point, the measurement piece is key. So capturing all that data, seeing where it's coming from. We then look at the analysis of that data and really working out where that consumption's what it's made up of, but also looking at the losses, so behavioural losses, are things being left on overnight, over the weekend, are things being left on standby, for example, but also looking at the technical losses, so things like voltage, power factor, harmonics in a building, things that we don't necessarily see. When we walk into a room, we know that the lights turn on, but we don't know, whether we're pulling too much or too little, for example. And then working with that customer, once we have a good understanding of the data, working with that customer to support them in the reduction of that consumption. There are two key drivers at the moment for most organisations, and it would be the case as well for schools, is carbon emissions. There's much more of a focus now on reducing carbon emissions where we can, reporting on that data. But also the bigger driver for most people is cost. We've seen huge increases in energy bills over the last 12 to 18 months. And we all need to, as any business, even, us at home, we need to look at how we can reduce our overall bill. So those are the three kind of key areas. But as I touched on just now, sustainability is becoming more and more important, and schools and universities at the moment represent around 36% of the total UK public sector building emissions. So it's quite a big number, and I think we all need to start looking at how we can reduce that number and how we can drill down. If we skip to the third bit, government policy. If you look at the targets that are set by government, by 2030, we want to reduce energy consumption from buildings and industry by 15%. So they're all quite big numbers, but in order to reduce, we need to see exactly how we are consuming, and I think that's the most important part. But I think that the bigger driver for everybody listening to this webinar, everyone will have been impacted by the rising energy prices. We saw that wholesale prices increased by about 400 to 600% in 2021, 2022. And although we've had support by government, there's still a problem. Once that support package is up, prices will still be high. And I think we need to look at, budgets are being squeezed significantly because of the energy bills. I would imagine it's probably one of the highest kind of categories in terms of spend. So it's really focused on what we can do about these 3 points. And if we look at the kind of climate adaptation, decarbonisation activity, we really focus on how we can include young people in that. And I've just put a couple of points that I've taken from the government website here, that young people can participate in the implementation of climate adaptation measures, learning buildings that are designed for net zero, understand more about the impact of energy and water use, and seeing sustainability brought to life. And I think there's a lot we can do with schools, universities, nurseries around including our young people in that strategy. And I think there's a lot that can be learned for kind of our future generations as well. So I wanted to just give some simple steps really to support organisations and to support the schools with what you can start to do to reduce energy use. And there's some very basic things, and there's some things that would probably require investment. But it's just a few things just to think about when you're looking at that energy reduction strategy. And the first bit for me is always key is the monitoring of energy. I mentioned earlier on, you can't reduce what you can't measure. And I think if you have a good understanding of where the wastage is, a lot of that, we say sustainability can cost it. Sustainability can actually reduce our costs. If we can find out where wastage is and we can just turn things off, it can be as simple as that in some cases. We can significantly reduce our energy bills, we can reduce our emissions. But also sharing that information with pupils, sharing it with staff, getting people involved as to understanding, if you leave something on, this is the impact it's having on our bill, this is the impact it's having on our emissions. And it starts to make people understand it's that behavioural piece is to the impact that is having. So monitoring energy and being able to include people in on that, include pupils, it will really make a big impact. Start with the basics, turn things off, as simple as it is. There's so many businesses we work with that we start monitoring and there's timers being left on, people are leaving computers on over the weekend, leaving lights on over the weekend. It can make a significant difference, even if we just say, right, make sure when everyone leaves for the weekend, make sure everything's turned off, because it can make a big difference. Adjust adjust temperature controls to cool the rooms. Heating forms a big part of that, which I think we go on to later on in the presentation. But looking at those temperature controls, do we need the heating on and us opening the windows at the same time, which is, can be quite can happen quite a lot. So start to look at those controls and make sure that we're all aware of things that need to be switched off and turned off over the weekend, overnight. The third piece is the energy management, and there's things that we can do now and there's things that might require kind of capital investment to invest in later on. But look at your existing lighting controls, your existing heating controls, as I mentioned, to reduce that wastage. I've got here, it can reduce emissions by up to 40%. So it's a very big number if we just look at heating and lighting alone. Heating costs can increase by 8% for every 1 degree increase. So that's a big number. So if you can just switch it, a couple of degrees, 1 degree, couple of degrees, it can make a big difference. And make sure that they are reflective of what's going on in the school. Do you need the heating on in every room when you've got classes that aren't in every room? Do we need to warm the sports hall up if there's no one there for the morning? So there's things that we just need to start thinking about to start setting it, and again, a lot of it's a behavioural thing, but we need to start looking at having those controls and measures in place. And the fourth and final piece really is the energy efficient equipment. So again, looking at lighting controls, ICT equipment's a big one, and there's a lot that can be done with the reduction of computers or energy consumption in computers. We've got an example of a solution that we've put in place with computers, and they can reduce energy consumption by 21% and 44% per computer. So it's a big number if you've got an IT suite full of 30, 40 computers can make a big difference. Looking at ventilations, cooling rather than relying on air conditioning. We need to start looking at what's in the building and what we can do with what we already have and what we can invest in the future. So just as an overview as what we do, I mean, we support organisations with the measurements and the reduction of that energy. Just gives you an idea as to the sorts of reports that we offer. But as I mentioned, I think that measurement is key, because until you know exactly how you're consuming, you can't reduce that. And then start to look at a short, medium and long-term plan as to how we can start to reduce that consumption. I'm more than happy to support where we can. And I'll leave it to questions now, if that's okay.
Brilliant. Thank you very much for that, Hannah. There's plenty to digest there, and I suppose some of the points that you were talking about, one of the things, talking about how the recent impact in increasing wholesale prices has affected schools. I know from schools I've spoken to, the schools I worked in, especially over COVID, it just felt like it was an inescapable problem. Our prices increased, but there's no competition effectively. So how have you found schools? Have they been able to find cheaper deals with other providers and move from that perspective? Or how have they managed to get a hold on the increasing costs?
Yeah, I think the reality is there isn't as much of a hold on costs. I mean, you can go to different companies and get a cheaper deal, but the reality is, if you look at the wholesale market, it's increased significantly. I think in 2019, schools alone were spending around £630 million a year on energy. It's a big number, and if we look at the increases we've had, 400% in a year, what that does to an energy bill. Unfortunately, no matter how you might be able to get a better deal by 1 or 2%, but it's not going to reduce it to the numbers that we were looking at a few years back. So I think we've been supported by the support scheme that's been available, and I know that's been extended. But the reality is prices are still significantly higher than they were 3-4 years ago. And I guess the focus now is what we can do around reducing that. The only thing to do is reduce consumption.
I think you talked there about the way of the important step in moving towards that reduction of consumption is in measuring. Is there much that schools can do individually to kind of measure their consumption? You obviously talked about the behavioural step change and what that can make a difference, but how can they potentially measure what they need to change?
Yeah, so schools can measure. I mean, you tend to find with if schools have got a number of different buildings, first of all, it's understanding out of those buildings which is consuming the most. What we tend to do is have a bit of a zoomed in approach. So we'll first of all say, okay, let's have a look at in each individual building and look at how they're consuming, and then start focusing on equipment. So, for example, monitoring the ICT equipment, or the usage of the ICT equipment, monitoring the lighting. If you've got air conditioning units, monitoring those, because you'll be surprised at how much wastage there is. If you've got old lighting, for example, the difference in consumption if you move to LED lighting, or if you've got an old air conditioning unit that's actually wasting more energy than it needs to, that might be a kind of something that we put in place. Say, okay, in a few years' time, we'll look to replace that air conditioning unit because it's actually costing us more money in the wastage than it would be if we replaced it to a more energy efficient unit. So there's a lot that can be done. I think it's monitoring those sorts of areas to see, okay, what can we do now? What can we do in a few months' time? What do we need to wait for, for a couple of years? And again, start to get that action plan in place. But it's understanding where it is first that's key.
And is there an ideal time frame? You mentioned kind of months, immediate, 2 years time. Is there an ideal time frame for the monitoring process to kind of assess, in your opinion, Hannah?
I would say as soon as possible, because there'll be things there that can be turned off now that can save money today. I've got a prime example. We worked with a manufacturer, and we started monitoring within 4 days. The Monday morning after we'd monitored over the weekend, it was clear there's been a timer left on. every morning at 7 o'clock, the timer goes on and it's consuming, I think, about £80 worth of energy a day. Within the first 10 minutes of us looking at the data, they turn the timer off, and that's an £80 a day saving. And that's, you know, that's a behavioural thing. That's something that you can do here and now. So I think the monitoring piece is get it in as soon as you can, start to understand, you know, what are the quick wins in essence, what can we do now that don't cost us any money, and start to change that behaviour. I think once everybody starts to understand the impact things are having, you know, the impact it's having if you're leaving things on, once we understand the impact, then changes can be made much quicker, I'd say.
Definitely, and schools are obviously a place to enact change from. You know, we're educating young minds. I really like what you're saying about bringing the pupils and the staff along with your kind of energy evaluation and strategy for reducing costs in school, because of it reduces costs, but effectively you talked about sustainability and CO2 reductions. This impacts us all, doesn't it? Not just the immediate issue of costs within schools. You talked about how sustainability can justify its costs. It can be cost neutral, cost negative in most cases. Do you find that schools are having pressure put on them for sustainability at the moment, outside of the kind of the energy efficiency cost perspective as well?
Yeah, I'd say so. And I think, you know, as we, and, you know, I'm not a teacher, I don't know enough about it, but if you look at Ofsted reporting, it's starting to come into the curriculum as well, around sustainability. And I think there will be much more pressure on schools now, not only to teach this, you know, the aspect of sustainability and what it means for the planet, and how, you know, our young people can start to make changes to make a better environment for the next generation to come. But also, you know, looking at what those buildings are doing. You know, we mentioned the 36% of the UK public sector emissions are from schools. There will be a pressure to start to reduce that, and I think the more that we can do as a more of a collaborative approach with pupils, with staff, we can get to that point much quicker, I'd say.
Brilliant. And finally, I think, Hannah, from my perspective, in terms of all these things that schools can do, the behavioural steps, is there any support, whether it be financial or kind of consultative advice out there for schools to access at the moment to start themselves on this journey of sustainability and energy efficiency?
Yeah, so there seems to be, I mean, in terms of financial support, there is a decarbonisation scheme. I think we've just finished, I think it's the decarbonisation scheme 3B, and we can send links out as well. That's just finished, but if you keep an eye on those tend to come in every few months, where you can apply for funding for kind of different solutions, but also speak to your local authorities, because there's usually grant funding available for kind of local areas, and also, you know, just support from, if you look at for us, it's the Business Growth Hub, but there'll be different platforms available for reduction, whether that's energy site surveys or whether it can point you in the right direction of solution providers in your area that could access other grant funding as well. So there's a lot of support available. I think it's just trying to find out specific to your area what can be kind of when it comes out and what can be used. So we can send some links following this with a couple of local levels and kind of government levels, what's available now, and what we expect to see in the future as well.
Brilliant. I'm sure you'd be happy to speak to any schools, Hannah, that want to find out a bit more. So we'll get the information out for anyone who wants to get in touch as well, if you're happy with that. But really appreciate your time, and thank you very much for sharing with us.
You're very welcome. Thank you.